Today's subject is something that I have never spoken on. Now, I've spent a lot of time working on this, a lot of thought. Much of this today is more theological and theoretical, but I really do believe that Christians should understand backgrounds of things. We shouldn't just be spouting words that we don't understand. Now, there are some things that are moral issues that the Bible does not speak of. It does not give clear direction on. Abortion is one of those things. We've talked about that before. Abortion is a product of modern medicine, and there was no abortion, of course, in biblical times. There was no modern medicine. And so it's not surprising. The Bible doesn't talk about it. But I would like for us to talk about another one of those things today. Now, we've talked in here before about the situation where, let's say, you're in your house at 3 o'clock in the morning and someone breaks in, comes busted in. And there you are with your family, and this person is intent on killing you and your family. And we talked about how the reasonable thing to do in that situation would be, if you get your gun first, shoot them to protect yourself and your family. And we talked about how you would be justified in doing that. And when we talked about it specifically in the context of Jesus saying, turn the other cheek. And even though Jesus did tell us to turn the other cheek, it would not be reasonable for you to just stand there and let somebody kill you and your whole family if you had the means to prevent it. That would not be the reasonable thing to do. Now, that situation involves using deadly force, an individual using deadly force, and that's pretty straightforward. It's an example, though, of individual morality. But what about groups and what about nations? What are the standards for using deadly force among nations? What are the moral standards for war? Now, this is a subject that has been discussed often in Christianity for at least the past 1,600 years. And it led to something which is called the just war theory. And interestingly enough, although Americans disagree on many issues like abortion, same-sex marriage, the death penalty, the great majority of Americans agree with the just war theory to the point where there's virtually no discussion on it. It's only a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of people who are opposed to that. So I want us to think about that today. Now, if you look in the New Testament, you won't see much about war, or at least the morality of it. Now, Jesus did say, blessed are the peacemakers. But if you look at that statement in its context, it seems like Jesus is referring to in our personal lives rather than conflict among nations. It doesn't seem like it refers to war from the context. Now, it may though. But if it does, it's not an explicit enough reference for us to be able to definitely say that when Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, he was talking about war. Of course, Jesus told us to turn the other cheek. Again, the context of that seems to be in our personal lives. And frankly, you can look at just about all the teachings of Jesus and see that they concern our personal lives, our individual behavior. Jesus did not really involve himself in group societal behavior. His teaching was about our personal lives. Now, there are a number of references to soldiers in the New Testament, but they are all neutral in regard to war. In other words, the morality of war itself is not mentioned in the references to soldiers. The soldiers back then were seen as quite a bit differently than they are today. Armies back then were as much concerned with policing society and maintaining order in society as they were about going to fight a war against another country. They did not have police departments and sheriff's departments back then. The army was the police and the sheriff. And so soldiers maintained law and order in society and enforced the will of whoever was government making the decision. Now, when we think of soldiers, we think of like the army going out to fight a war. But when they thought of soldiers back then, they thought more in terms of like the sheriff's department or the police department. We don't see any explicit references to the morality of war in the Gospels, and neither do we see any explicit references to the morality of war in the rest of the New Testament. There's nothing in the New Testament that explicitly talks about that. There are some passages that you could apply. One of them is Romans 12. It says, "Do not avenge yourself, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord.' Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Now, it's not clear if that's referring to enemy in the sense of enemy as another nation, or whether that's referring to enemy as the sense of your personal enemy, but the context of it leads us to believe it's more of a personal thing. However, you could take the position that you could apply this to war. And if that's the case, then it would prevent acts of revenge. Tit for tat things like, you bomb me, I'll bomb you. You kill 3 of our soldiers, we'll kill 30,000 of yours. So maybe it does apply to stuff like that. That's the same for any of the other passages you can point to. And so we get no explicit guidance from the New Testament on the morality of war. And if you look at the New Testament writings that have survived if you look at the writings that have survived during the period soon after the New Testament period, you won't find much mention of war there either. And that leads to a disagreement among people as to how the early Christians felt about war. Some take the position the early Christians were pacifists. Others disagree. I don't think we know enough about the history of ancient Christianity because not enough has survived for us to know for any certainty what the ancient Christians' attitudes toward war was. They may themselves have disagreed about it for all we know. Now, because of that, over the years, Christians have tried to derive a position on war, and what came out of that is, of course, the just war theory. No one really knows the origin of it. Some people say it started with a man named Augustine back in the 400s. You'll remember he is our not-so-good friend who came up with the idea of original sin. And others, though, say that it comes from the times before Christianity. From what I've been able to find, my opinion is that while the origins of it may have started earlier, the just war theory as we know it did not come into being until the 14 or 1500s. The reason for that is because it was only in the 14 or 1500s that the modern concepts of nations came into being. You know, we think they've always had like the United States, Canada, and Mexico, but you know, that is sort of a modern way of dividing the world up into nations like that. That's not been being done all that long. Before the world was seen as divided up into nations, war was seen to be mainly something that individuals participated in. But after the concept of nations came into being, war began to be seen as something that it was a national thing. And the individual soldiers who fought were merely instruments through which the nation projected its will. So it was in maybe the 15 and 1600s that war began to be seen not as a personal moral decision, but as a national decision. And so the focus of the morality of war shifted from a focus on personal morality to the morality of the nation as a whole. And an idea became popular that morality for a group is different from morality for an individual. And that is the idea that really underlies the just war theory. The moral standards for an individual are one thing. The moral standards for a nation are another. That's the thing that underlies the just war theory. Now, from the outset, we need to realize that if we have something called the just war theory, and if it is accepted by virtually 99% of Christians in the United States, then obviously the broad swath of Christianity must believe that at least some wars can be justified. After all, if you took the position that no war could be justified, you would not need a just war theory. So the fact that it even exists means that by far most Christians believe some wars can be justified. Now, the just war theory developed based on an individual's right to self-defense. Just like we talked about earlier, somebody comes storming in at 3 o'clock in the morning, intent on killing you and your family. That's where the just war theory starts, and it is expanding to include nation concerns. But remember that the personal morality standards are different, according to the just war theory, for nations than there are for people. And so eventually the just war theory expanded to not only including self-defense, like somebody rushes in to kill you, but it expanded to include defense of a nation's interests, whatever that might be needed to mean at the particular time. So there is no single statement of the just war theory. Exactly how it's stated will depend on who you're talking to, but there is a core set of principles based on a number of different questions. And so essentially the just war theory is a way of judging whether any particular war is justified or not by answering a set of questions. And the way those questions are answered will determine whether the war is just. The questions are divided into 2 parts. The first part deals with whether this particular war is justified. The second set of questions deals with your conduct of it. Here are some of the questions from the first set. Is this self-defense against an attack or the threat of an imminent attack? Is the authority undertaking the war competent? Have peaceful alternatives been exhausted? Is there reasonable hope of success? Are you keeping an eye open for possible de-escalation as soon as possible? What will victory look like, not just from the standpoint of defeating the opposing army, but also what will the situation be in that land when the opposing army is defeated? Do you have a reasonable chance of achieving a goal in this war other than just the defeat of an opposing party? Now those are the main questions of the first section. The main questions of the second section are those. Is the force used proportional to the cause the war is supposed to serve? Will you take care that non-combatants are not killed? Are the attacks only on military targets? Are prisoners of war treated humanely? And so according to the just war theory, whether any particular war is justified will depend on the answers to those questions. So I want to stop for a minute and think about something. I want to think about the difference between subjective and objective. Objective depends on facts. There's only one answer, you know what it is. What does 2 plus 2 equal is an objective question. It equals 4. There's no argument about it. If you don't believe it, you can lay down 2 pennies and 2 more and count and see if you got 4. It's provable. It'll always come up 4. Another example is Tim wearing a shirt? That's an objective question. I'm either wearing one or not. And I'm wearing one. There's only one answer. I am wearing it. That's objective. Subjective, though, depends on your perspective. The question, how does coffee taste, is subjective. You may love coffee. The person over here may hate it. You're both right. It's just a personal preference. It's like whether you like Coke or Pepsi. They're both okay if you like them. Is it cold outside? That's another subjective question. It may be cold to you when it's 65 degrees outside. It may not be cold to another person until it gets to 30. That's a subjective question. It depends on the individual. All the questions posed by the just war theory are subjective. Look at the first question. Is this self-defense against an imminent attack? Well, what does attack mean? To me, it might mean that cannons and artillery are rolling across the Canadian border down into the United States. To you, it might mean an attack on justice, however you might want to define that. It might mean an attack on another country that you happen to like. Or it might mean an attack on some kind of commercial interest, like a cargo ship. So is an attack just an invading army storming across the border? Is it missiles in the air coming toward us right now? Or do we have a broader definition of what attack is? So what's imminent? Does imminent mean within the next 30 minutes? Next 30 days? Or just that you think they might sometime do it? Do the missiles have to be in the air headed this way for it to be imminent? Or can you knock them out when they first start installing them? You say, well, that's imminent. That's imminent. You see, all these questions in the just war theory depends on your perspective. And that means that if we want to, we can come up with answers to those questions that will make any war I can imagine justifiable. The standards are manipulable. Jesus said, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And you know what Jesus was asked after he said that? He was asked, who is my neighbor? Now you can look at that question, who is my neighbor, as the person trying to set limits when Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, Jesus said, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And this man asked, okay, then who can I hate? That's really what the guy was asking. Who do I not have to love? Who can I hate? Who is it okay to hate? And you know, really in actual practice, that's what the just war theory has led to. No country from their own perspective ever fights an unjust war. Every war is justified in the eyes of the combatants on both sides. Each side feels as if it has the just war theory on its side. No government has ever announced to the world, we're going to fight an unjust war. Every war is fought by two opposing sides, each of which believes that it has right on its side. Think about it. Often in actual practice, the just war theory is invoked after the fact to justify what was done. It's used by the victors to justify what they have done. Have you ever heard of any victor in a war being indicted and tried for war crimes? No. It's only the losers that get that treatment. All our wars have been just. In every war we've ever fought, it's been our opponents that were in the wrong. We've always had just war theory on our side. Our opponents have never had any elements on their side. You see, that kind of thinking is often what the just war theory leads to. Even in Christianity, with few exceptions, the great majority of major Christian organizations have been behind their government in every war. Maybe after the war they might say, well, we shouldn't have done that. But during the war, they're all there. If you look at Russia and Ukraine right now, the Russian Orthodox Church is squarely behind Russia and its side of the war. The Ukraine Orthodox Church is squarely behind Ukraine and its side of the war. And so the Christians themselves feel that each of their side is the right side. And that's usually the way it goes. There was a theologian named Reinhold Niebuhr in the early 20th century. He was a popular figure in mainline Christianity back then. Taught at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, and that was a big deal back then. He had been a big supporter of the United States' involvement in World War I. After the war was over, though, he changed his mind. And in the 1920s and the 1930s, Niebuhr wrote a lot about that, and he regretted his support for U.S. involvement in World War I, and he said, I hope that when the next war rolls around, we won't be so quick to jump on the bandwagon behind it. It wasn't too many more years till World War II rolled around, and guess what? Reinhold Niebuhr became one of the biggest supporters of U.S. involvement in World War II. It's always been that way. You can count on it. Always been that way. Now, when the Bible does not speak to an issue, we have to derive a position by looking at things the Bible does say. That's called a derived position. Now, most Christian doctrines that have derived in response to certain societal conditions at a certain point of time. And that's true of the just war theory. At the time the just war theory was being developed, war was extremely cruel, and it often involved the wholesale slaughter of entire groups of people. And you see, the just war theory was seen as a way to mitigate that. Maybe it wasn't ideal, but it certainly was an improvement over what had been. And the just war theory was developed to operate as a means of restraint. It was designed to prevent cruelty that often happened in the ancient world when wars took place. It was intended to be a restraint before beginning something. Something that would cause people to say, now wait a minute, let's think about this a minute. Let's be sure this is necessary. And if it is necessary, let's be sure we do it in the most understated way possible. And so the just war theory developed as a tool of restraint. It soon began to be used, though, as a way to justify what we want. When you think about it, the last time Americans actually felt the effects of war firsthand was during the Civil War. And that was only down here in the South. All the wars we've been involved in since then have been involved with security. And that means that we have engaged with countries that had no capability of engaging back on continental United States soil. Even in World War II, either Germany or Japan, either one, had the capability to bomb or invade the continental United States. We have been able to fight wars from security, and we have not had to worry about their bombs falling in our neighborhoods. Our wars are no longer fought like Vietnam was, where every night on the TV news we see pictures of the body bags being shipped back to the United States. Our wars are fought in relative safety. We bomb countries who have no capability to shoot our aircraft down. We launch missiles at countries who have no capability of hitting the continental United States with their missiles. What is the morality of direct military strikes on people who have no capability to strike back at us? You see, that's a moral question. It really is. That's a moral question. But it's a question that Christianity has really never dealt with. It's a question that just war theory doesn't address. Our country regularly assassinates people in the Middle East by the use of drones. It hasn't been that long ago since they said they killed some kind of leader somewhere over there, but it turned out that the thing hit the wrong target. It actually hit a car with a family in it and killed a bunch of children. And just a few weeks ago, they killed more civilians using a drone that was targeted at an individual in Iraq, but it caused a lot of collateral damage. What is the morality of sending a drone to bomb a car on a city street in the Middle East? What is the morality of doing that in mistargeting and killing children? That is a moral question. But again, it is a question that Christianity has never dealt with. And it's a question just war theory does not deal with either. You see, when we talk about stuff like this, we're talking about multiple issues, very complicated issues. They are issues that neither Jesus nor the New Testament directly address. But yet, when it's our bomb and our stuff killing halfway on the other side of the globe, it is something that Christian morality should think about. I think it is one of the most difficult moral issues for me to take a position on. To me, it dwarfs things like abortion and same-sex marriage. To me, this is the most critical thing that Christianity needs to come to terms with. And I can tell you, I have not derived my own position on this stuff. It's a confusing and unclear issue for me too. I don't know, in other words. I don't know what the Christian position should be. I do think about this a lot, especially recently. But I don't know what the Christian position should be. The just war theory may have been useful at one time, and it may have done what it needed to do 500 years ago and lessen the cruelty of wars, but situations today are different. And that's not providing much help to us. You know, the Bible tells us that in some way we will be held accountable for the things we have done in life when our life is over. Now, we do believe that God is merciful. However, I think there is enough in the Bible that says we will be held to some accountability that we can't ignore that. You know, we can't willy-nilly go through life doing as we please and say, well, you know, God's merciful. I don't think it'll work that way. Although we do believe God is merciful, we need to be careful about things we do, because they may very well follow us through eternity.